the stuff that's going on is not unpurposeful. There's something that's why that's important to them. And it doesn't matter if I'm never going to get a tattoo because of whatever story I heard, whatever my past told me. It's important for me to realize that for that person, there is something that's important about that. And do I take the time to hear why?
We have to remember what Joseph Campbell said too about gangs and about these cliquish things that younger generations are going. We as adults are not carrying on the moral mythology that they crave, so they're making their own.
Yeah, yeah. And how do we do that? It's by hearing their culture. Do I give value to the story, even if it's not one that I understand or think has as much value as whatever it is I'm trying to give to them? Do I listen to what they're trying to do, or do
Isn't that how St. Francis started for the LGBT community?
In many ways, it was about trying to hear what somebody was saying and live into what we were already thinking of, those things about love. And it was John Stetson, for example, stepping up and saying, well, here's some people who need to be loved. What are you going to do about it? And St. Francis saying, well, if we're saying this is who we are, then.
I'll get quiet for a little while. Sorry, I'm a little. First time in 3 weeks that I can actually keep a thought.
and at least part of what, why we group people really quickly into cultural spaces is because then we can write some off easily, can't we? Anybody who does this, or anybody acts this way, or anybody who speaks this way, it's really easy for us to write that off. So let me tell you about a friend of mine from high school. His name was Shelby T. Lewis. He always, he mostly went by T. So T was a man, great big black man, and he had all the stereotyped definitive traits in that, he did all the things and wore all the things just like all the people around him. He wore a great big belt buckle and jeans and boots and a huge hat, and he was a bull rider.
Mm.
Not what you would expect from a black man, is it?
No.
But he fit very well into the cowboy kicker culture of South Texas because he took on other stereotyped roles and behaviors, right? And so if I just look at Shelby T or any number of different people, I could have just said, he's a black man, he's this. And Shelby was much more than just that, very different than just that. But you had to stop and get to know him and see what was important to him. And see that there was much more than whatever stereotype was there. His behavior was important. And the choices he made were important to him. Have you known somebody like that who in listening to him, to that person, you figured out something very different? Go ahead.
I was having this discussion with Evelyn, so she knows some of the people around here, right? She's been working for the census and hoping that they'll hire her full time right now. But we were talking about the whole appearance stuff, and we've been very mindful about not saying a couple things like those people or those folks, or I have a XYZ friend, gay, black, whatever. And I started chuckling. She goes, what are you laughing at? And I said, I don't know. I know Harvey's good-natured, right? He's got that beautiful tan. How would folks feel if I walked in and I said, I got this brown friend. I think you know him. He's Harvey.
Yeah.
Because as far as melanin, he's darker than I am.
Right. But it's all tan on white skin. Right. And and that's what this point is about behavior, is we have to look at who the person is, not some other definition that's that group of people, right? And it's easy for us to do that. That's part of how we make sense of the world, is by grouping people, but often at the detriment of some of those people.
Which people?
Whoever those people are, right?
Those people that go
Sorry.
to St. Francis.
Yeah, and it's very simple to do that from any place of advantage. That's the real difficulty, is when I, as a person of advantage, do it. I watched a movie this week, an interesting movie from mid 1960s, France, called Black Girl, and it's about a woman from Senegal who meets up with a couple there who give her a job as a nanny, and then say, will you come to France with us? And she's excited about that because she thinks it means, let me go see this country. What they really mean is, will you come clean our house and never leave our house? And that's not what she wanted. But they wanted to use her from one point of who she was, and not, they didn't even want to really pay her, because they'd given her this opportunity to go to another country. See, all of that is not seeing the behavior, and she begins to mope, and in fact she falls into some of the what we often do. How many have ever heard the stereotype that black people are lazy? Well, she begins to be the lazy black. Why? Because they're not letting her be a full person. And so she begins to, almost in protest, live out this, I'm not going to be anything for you because you're not letting me be the person that I am.
And I'm going to say something that's a little shocking. Within the Hispanic culture,
Yeah.
Second, third generation Hispanic Americans that are still culturally tied to Mexico,
Yes.
have acquired that culture as well. I've known friends, I was really deliberate in telling my cousins, my children, my cousins' children, we've all talked about it, but the generation above us would go to Mexico and tell people, hey, we'll give you an opportunity, come to us. And they'd set them up in their laundry room with a cot. And again, not let them go, not give them enough money to go home, not even give them the freedom to go and do the grocery shopping. They were just there to cook and clean. And Jim, I think that's why I'm kind of in the middle, right? Yeah. Because that's a part of American culture that is across the board.
Well, but it's really not. It's this thing though is not about denigrating culture or not culture. It's looking at this particular person and seeing this particular person for his or her behavior, not and then not ascribing that to all of the group to which they belong. Or expecting that because they're a part of a certain group that they're always going to act a certain way, right? One of the things about culture, going back to the last chapter, which is the right culture, the industriousness of American culture or Mexican culture who chooses to take a siesta. There's not necessarily a wrong or a right to that answer. What you have to do is you have to go to each person and say, why do you do what you do? What is it that's true about you and about the choices you make, right? Because somebody who chooses to take a siesta might be because they woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning and began their job and they're ready to take a break.
And culturally, that's what we're taught. Growing up in this area in Texas, it gets freaking hot in the middle of the day.
Yeah.
So you get up at the break of dawn and you start working, and then everything shuts down. But when that, before American culture started mixing in, it was a cultural thing. Everybody was working early. Come noontime, they shut down until about 4 or 5 in the afternoon. And then they started moving again. So the movement of the culture was a lot different than what we have now.
So let me tell you a story from my very first year teaching first graders. A little kid named Jason was in that classroom. And he was not, in any sense of the word, an exceptional student. He struggled with many of the things that we gave to him, except for one thing, and that was money. Where a lot of my kids would struggle to count pennies and a nickel, Jason had it down. I could give him any amount of money, and he would figure it out. And so I talked to his mom and said, how does he know all this? And she was reluctant to tell me, very reluctant to tell me. I said, no, it's really a good thing that he's doing all this. I want to know how he came by all this ability. And she said, I think it's because I go to the bar for a couple hours every night and I give him some money and he goes and spends it. He has the ability to use it because he uses it, right? And so he's getting that ability for the wrong reasons, but he had that ability. So after that, instead of trying to teach how to use money, I began giving paper coins out as a reward so that then they could use it to spend and learn how to spend and use money, right? And so it changed, this kid changed the very way I taught part of my curriculum. And literally for the rest of my career as an elementary school teacher, I taught it differently because of Jason. But to do that, I had to listen to his behavior and know why it was he had the behavior he had, because that was a high point of his behavior, right? That was something good that I should glean from him. And if I just write somebody off as being whatever I think they are, which is what we often do in education. And so I struggled a bit with this chapter because he's talking about education and I want to defend that profession. But the reality is that we put a whole bunch of stuff on these aptitude tests instead of listening to behavior. And so I love the part where he said this. What was it? He asked a couple of questions. What if all along these well-meaning efforts at closing the achievement gap have been opening the door to racist ideas, where we are judging kids by my standards, not by their behaviors? And then he asked three very pointed questions. What if different environments lead to different kinds of achievement rather than they lead to different kinds of achievement rather than different levels of achievement? What if we measured intelligence by how knowledgeable individuals are about their own environments? What if we measured intellect by an individual's desire to know? And so do I start looking at individuals and asking what their life is teaching them, or do I try to match them to my idea of curriculum and life, right? Taking it out of the educational world. Am I looking at that Black kid or that Black adult and saying, you don't fit inside of my ideals? Or do I see how they are who they are?
I had 4 kids. And those of you that raise kids, once you get more than 2 kids, you're raising 4 different little people. You can't, and it's this, you can't raise them all the same. You can have the same rules, but you have to communicate with each of them different. We learn that as parents. We definitely learn it as teachers, right? I feel for you, for Joni, for all the teachers, because you're limited in time and resources, and now there's so many kids in the class that it's very hard to do that with your kids teaching them. Jim, you've got 3 kids that are auditory learners, 3 that are visual, 8 that are kinetic. learners. And your structure doesn't let you, in a lot of cases, even the resources don't let you mold your teaching instructions. So people don't understand how much time you have to take in getting to know the kids.
Yeah, but
and structuring it in a way that they all can learn from it.
yeah, but the real more important point is this: how do we do that to each other in the rest of the world? I mean, how do we expect everyone to fit into what's easy for me instead of hearing what it is that they truly are, so that I move towards them and maximizing those strengths in order to move forward.
And I would say something too. When we do that, whether it's because of social status or color, understand the ones that we're doing it to have a story about you too.
Yeah.
You're arrogant, you're disconnected. There's all kinds of nasty words I can come up with that I've heard.
Yes, absolutely.
So
and how do we help each other?
Yeah, we create a cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, in Minnesota, there's all the Norwegian jokes, right? That we tell, and those are those stereotyped type of things about here's how they act. Now, in today's world, the Northern Europeans that immigrated to North Dakota and Minnesota have branched out into a whole bunch of different things, aren't they, Nancy?
Sure.
No matter if there were stereotypes at one point, those things don't fit most of the people that are there, correct?
Right.
And so you learn how to ask people. You say, look, I don't want to make lutefisk for you if you don't like it, right? Because most people don't like it any longer, do they?
Right. But it surprises me how often someone will say something like, oh, he's just like, you know, all those Germans.
Yeah, yeah.
I had a Jewish friend one time. She goes, I'm so tired of everybody asking me where to get lox and bagels. I don't eat lox and bagels. Yeah.
Yeah.
We do it all over the place. But what I have found, because I've lived in rural, semi-rural, and urban areas, and trying to work with Hispanics and greater chambers even, we're seeing a big societal norm difference between those of us in urban or semi-urban areas and the rural areas. And we have the stereotypes of a farmer or a rancher, that they're kind of slow and they're not sophisticated. They're not slow, they're precise. They observe. They don't talk much.
Yeah.
Not like urban folks.
Right.
And we discount what they've learned by what they do in being farmers and ranchers. And they learn a very common sense way of thinking. It's very simple, but it's by no means unintelligent.
Yeah.
Like the idea that cowboys were dumb, they just rode horses and shot guns. Some of the most literate people I've ever known are ranchers, that they don't have any, watching the cows, they don't have anything to do but read.
My granddaddy used to carry a book in his back pocket. As you know, we've ranched the mountains of Arizona for decades, since the 1870s. And he used to carry a notebook in his back pocket and write poetry. And so I have several books of his poetry. He was a poet laureate of Arizona, as he sat on his horse and would write down his little things. And you're right, that those are some of the examples. Now, let's take it to the more critical space. It's really easy to look down on a cowboy, or from a cowboy's perspective, look the other direction and look down. But we still, both those, have a certain amount of privilege. we also look down on some of the behaviors that in ways that people can't escape from it as easily. Okay, so if we go to the field of education, he was very clear about testing industry, for example, that makes it very difficult for people of color and people of lower economic spaces to succeed at that, right? And that we of more advantage can buy our way forward. So let me tell you.
You're seeing that right now with the virtual learning.
Yes.
There's a whole mess of kids getting locked out of it.
That's right. Or getting substandard with it. Even if they have a device now, it's much harder sometimes to be able to do that. So if mom has the luxury to be able to be home, even if she doesn't want to, that's a whole different thing from a working class family where both mom and dad work 9 to 5 jobs and they literally can't really be home. And do we take that into account as we make the decisions we make? Right? Let me tell you examples. So the testing industry, which has grown well since in the 20 years since I left education. No, I shouldn't say well. It's grown a lot. I'm not sure it's grown well. Even back then, as I'm giving these tests to my kids, the pictures that were being shown were ones that were much easier, not all of them, but some of them were from Anglo history and culture, and a Hispanic person may and may not know that picture as easily. Okay? It may not look like the thing they know. So a top, for example, the toy, they might show what was an English version of that word, which may or may not look the same as what the Mexican version of that same word was, right? It's that type of thing that unknowingly we were testing kids and saying these kids are lower, but it had nothing to do with their cognitive ability. It had to do with their experiential ability, what kind of things they knew or didn't know. And so they might have a man that's there and he's got a hat on. And so an Anglo kid might very easily recognize that man as a cop, where a Hispanic kid might not know that word yet, right? Hasn't encountered that word. And so it's trying to figure out what rhymes with police, right? Or something similar to that. And are we, in all cases, testing kids, or are the tests the racist problem, as he says? Is the educational system, is the economic system? In this world, are we working against the behaviors that somebody has? Go ahead.
Places like Atlanta, for example, they're trying to codify Ebonics because it's used so much within the urban areas. And I'm hearing these damn kids want to speak Ebonics. Why aren't they learning English? And they don't understand that our language is regional and it changes. So Ebonics in Atlanta is different than Ebonics in Chicago, because in Atlanta, it has a lot of the Southern idioms along with it. Then Louisiana has a bunch of French in it. And we're not giving these communities credit for their complexity.
Right. And that's because we're saying something else is the standard. English is the standard. Everyone needs to have this or else.
But we started doing that in the 80s. Just look at our newscasters, right?
We
used to get news locally with the local accents. In the 80s, the corporations started saying, no, you got to get rid of it and you got to all sound the same. So they were eroding culture by taking away our dialects or our accents.
Yeah. So you know what happens with that? Okay, so you know the last 9 years that I taught bilingual classes. Okay, and people would come, oh, you're teaching in Spanish, they've got to learn English. And here's what happens if you do that. Let me see if I can show you this on the screen in some way or another. If this is a kid, if this is a graph of a kid learning English, I'm going to try to hold this up. And they start down here at 0.0. All right, and not just learning English, also it's also success in the classroom, right? Do they learn the things that do they learn the things that I want them to learn? And so there's two main ways to be able to learn English: bilingual education, which I was teaching, or ESL. Now, ESL is easier for if you don't have people who speak Spanish, or if you want to say my language is more important than your language. Okay, so here's what happens. ESL, the typical growth pattern is like this. They learn quickly and they level off. Okay? So they step into learning much faster, or into English learning much faster at least. If you teach bilingually, look what happens. That's the curve for bilingual education. This up here is what do they ultimately go away as? And if you know education, the 50th percentile is average. And so if you teach them ESL wise, they end up 10 points on the average, 10 points below average. Whereas if you let them have a double strand of language, even though their process is slower, they end up 10 points above. And so by forcing someone into my culture, my way of acting, I've actually consigned them to a lower position ability-wise, because I've taken away strands of how they could learn.
My mom's 92 years old. She grew up in a border town, so she and her younger brother were born in the United States, but immigrant family. 4 other children that spoke Spanish, and the parents. So she was one of those kids, went to school at 7 years old. She walked into school and they said, no more Spanish. And they had no clue because neither parent spoke English.
Right.
She grew up, and she still talks about it. The only saving grace for her is the school system still required that you learn Latin. And she went into medicine. Yeah, she was able to use the Latin and get through nursing college. They don't do that anymore. At least with the Latin, there was some bilingual education because the Romance language was closely associated with it. But she, to this day, doesn't feel that she ever learned either language well.
Right. Right. See, but much of why the bilingual education works better than the other is because we trust that who that person is wonderful and amazing, and that what they know over there will transfer over to something else. The other kind of says what you are is worthless. Let me just give you what I think is important. And
that reminds me of a man I saw on Amanpour this week talking about education, that what you are and who you are is wonderful. He would like to teach the kids, like ask them, what do you care about? What would you like to have changed in the world? And then what steps can you take to do that? Like they would make their own education rather than sitting and being shoved in facts from somebody else or things that other people want them to learn. But it would come from within. Like educate is drawing it from within rather than imposing it from without. And what you're saying made me think of that.
it's at least, Judith, valuing what is within that person.
Yes,
Because
exactly.
the teacher also has things to bring, or the society also has things to bring, which are valuable things. But if I try to impose my stuff on top of, at the expense of, often it becomes poor learning, right?
I had a movie suggestion for you on this thread. The James Edward Olmos movie with Lou Diamond Phillips and where he was the teacher in LA.
Yeah, Stand By Me. Is that what it is?
Stand and Deliver.
Stand and Deliver. Stand and Deliver.
Stand and Deliver. The best scene is when Lou Diamond Phillips comes into the math class and he has calculus written on the board. Here's a cultural difference. He reads it in Spanish and says, "Who is calculus?"
Yeah, yeah.
You know, and that movie shows that, Jim, it shows what you're talking about so well and what he thought culturally from the other teachers, because he had teachers and administrators telling him these kids can't do it.
Yeah. Yep.
And
And many of the ways we try to impose our culture on top of their behaviors is a way to be able to say, I have right answer and you don't.
mm-hmm.
And I get a stereotype about you from whatever it happens to be, whatever you're inputting into my head. And I just, and so I deal with you poorly instead of coming to you, learning who you are, and allowing that to enhance both of us. And we do
what
that.
what made me think of that movie was how defeated the parents were.
Yeah.
Right? Because of the messaging that they had gotten for a couple generations.
Yeah.
And said, okay, well, at least our way, our kids will get work and feed their families.
That's right.
And the greater culture had defeated that community's minority into thinking that they didn't have the ability, their kids didn't have the ability to go on and do these things. And I think at one point, one of the little girl, they had to leave to help the restaurant. The parents said, you can't live in the white world. And we've got to look at that.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's what this whole thing is about, is we have to look at individuals and help them, not judge them by whatever, right? Men have continually through the ages said women can only, right? At the expense of our society, because we're not using half of our people to the ability of what they could be.
And
right?
Everybody has something to bring.
Yeah, everybody has something to bring. And that's what this chapter is about. Do I see Shelby T for the cowboy that he is, or do I try to make him into my stereotype of the black man that I think he ought to be, or whoever that person is in front of me? My favorite line from this whole chapter was right at the end. He said, remove the tattooed stereotypes from every racialized body. All right, those things that we've placed on there and say, that's absolutely true. Remove those. It says behavior is something humans do, not races do. So it's essentially meet that person right where they are. So I have two announcements for you as we finish up today.
Yay, you remembered.
I did. What do you think of that? So on Sunday afternoon at 1 o'clock, we are going to bless animals. So come up to the church and bring your animals with you. But come up to the church even if you don't have an animal to be blessed, because let me tell you what's going to happen. I'm going to sit right in front of the celebration center, and I'm going to be right there, and across from me are going to be our children holding up Katie cans. All right? Because if you're like me, you've been collecting a lot of coins. Look at how many coins I've got over the last few months. And I need to get rid of them. So I'm having our kids stand out there, and while I'm blessing the animal on one side, you're going to be dumping your coins into their Katie cans on the other side. Okay? So come and give your Katie Can coins.
At 1
Right.
o'clock?
Yeah, go ahead.
1 o'clock on Sunday?
1 o'clock on Sunday.
Okay.
The second announcement is not as joyous. This morning I get a call from Grace Ruther, and Marv passed away today. So I went and sat with her for a time, and just know that she is struggling because of that, and will for a while. But he went relatively quietly today, and just keep her in your prayers as she goes through that, as she tries to figure out the next steps. They're going to have a service. They don't know when yet.
I had a question for you, Jim.
Yes.
I know you're still waiting on regional make decisions on opening things up. I'm being challenged in a number of ways with the art stuff, one by the instructors, and also being asked to create to join a gallery. But I'm playing with things. Will you take art donations?
I think so.
Okay.
Because
I ended up with the butterfly project. I ended up getting really complicated, and it's really cool. And I got a 2 by 3 foot butterfly for you that it's underway.
Know that at least one thing we're going to do where that might fit in really well is celebration team is already working on what will be our Lenten our Advent and Christmas journey. And if you remember, we had a big set of angel wings last year, a big angel that was in the celebration center. We're going to try to use that this year, but use the theme of wings more. And how do we give each other wings? You know, how do we rebirth each other in some way that allows us to fly out of all the things that are holding us earthbound during this year? So that might work really well for that.
I haven't quite finished cutting. Started cutting it out. I just finished the design, and I've got rolls and rolls of handmade paper, real fibrous paper, real brilliant colors. So,
all right, we may be able to use it.
I'll go with that theme now.
All right, that sounds good. Thank you very much.
Chapters 9 and 10. Chapters 9 and 10 for next time.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much.
Okay. Bye.
All right, we'll see you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a good week.
Sorry I was so talky, Jim.
It's all right.